from this.
Yes, the broadcast is live. I'm
Yay.
getting it. Hi, welcome everyone. We've got 1 minute till we start and, well, maybe 30 seconds. So we're just going to allow time for everybody to join. And I should start by saying such a very big welcome and a happy Empathy Day. So I'm Miranda McKearney. I'm from EmpathyLab and I'm here with some pretty wonderful panelists for the empathy conversation. So we have with us tonight Michael Rosen, much loved author, broadcaster, educator, COVID survivor. Thank goodness, Michael. We often include Michael's books in our annual Read for Empathy collection. And this one, oh, I'm so bad at angling books. The Missing is in our current collection about Michael's great uncles caught up in terrible Holocaust experiences. Next up, welcome to Catherine Johnson. Perhaps especially known for her historical fiction, which shines a light on the kind of hidden histories of people of colour. Catherine's one of those authors who brings a smile of affection and respect when you talk to her book world colleagues. And Freedom is in our latest collection. This book really helps you viscerally feel the horrors of slavery, and I hope Catherine will tell us a little bit more about it in a minute. David Baddiel, comedian, author, broadcaster, co-writer of Three Lions. It's very easy for an empathy book collection to get quite dark, so we were really pleased to include the Taylor Turbo Chaser in this year's collection with feisty Amy, who's mad about cars and turns her wheelchair into a souped up sports car, goes off on a huge adventure. Great for characters you really care about. And finally, EmpathyLab's psychology advisor, Professor Robin Banerjee, head of psychology at Sussex University, active in many forums, including advising Welsh Government, whose new curriculum gloriously features empathy 35 times. So EmpathyLab's strategy is based on two areas of scientific research. Firstly, that empathy is a learnable skill. And secondly, that books are a really potent tool to build it. And our vision is of a new generation of empathy-educated young people becoming wonderful parents, citizens, politicians, helping to shape a very much better world than my generation has managed. Empathy Day is one of our 5 key programs, founded 5 years ago to help more children, many more, have the chance to deeply explore, experience, and practice empathy. And the theme this year is walking in someone else's shoes. And today has been so full of such inspiring, moving activities. Empathy events in hundreds of schools, homes, libraries, includes of loads of children's empathy walks, empathy resolutions, plus really electrifying author and illustrator-led activities in our online festival. The idea being to surround children with powerful role models, focusing on the values, the practices, the skills of empathy, all through the lens of books. From Jacqueline Wilson giving her listening tips to Kwame Alexander in a mighty rousing piece about empathy as an antidote to prejudice. It's really made me feel hopeful for the future today. So in this finale event, we're creating a reflective space, a space where we can all learn about the psychology of empathy, the author's craft in building it, and how we can all of us use stories to help children build fantastic empathy skills and then put them into action. And goodness, what a time to be gathering together to think about how on earth we can build a more empathetic society as we emerge, with luck, into post-pandemic times. We've seen how the act of imagining ourselves in lockdown shoes, somebody else's lockdown shoes, has sparked an extraordinary flourishing of community connection and kindness, and we just really mustn't let our best selves fade. EmpathyLab passionately believes that both empathy is a crucial foundation for a better society and a vital life skill that every child deserves the chance to develop. Tonight, amongst other things, we're exploring how, as a society and an education system, we can use reading more deliberately in a new empathy drive. And we'll be talking a lot about books, so I'd really love to start with hearing our panel's recommendations for an empathy boosting book, because that echoes an absolutely massive crowdsourcing Read for Empathy activity that's been going on in communities and on the airwaves all day. So authors, of course, have a very particular understanding of empathy because they spend their days imagining the thoughts and feelings of their characters. So Catherine, might I start with you and your Read for Empathy recommendation?
It's this one. It's Mr. Bunny's Chocolate Factory, which is, I think children understand righteous indignation and being put upon. And maybe if parents are reading this to their children, they might understand that too. It's about hens, which are doing far too much work, and the chocolate factory owner who doesn't. So there we go. That's my book.
I love that book. Oh, I didn't know you were going to choose that.
Wow. I forgot to say, Ellis Dolan.
Very good. David, could we hear yours?
I'm going to choose one of Michael's books. I don't have a copy of it in the same way, which I should have done, but I'm going to choose The Sad Book by Michael, which is a classic, really. But I think particularly for this subject, for people who don't know, Michael wrote it following the death of his son from meningitis. And I think that as a children's book, or as a book of children understanding how life and life in extremis can happen to other people, but can also happen to them, and is something which doesn't just happen over there. That actually, if you can make a child understand how to deal with something like that and how to find a way through it, it's about as useful an act of writerly empathy that I can think of. So I'm going to choose Michael's book.
Oh, that's so wonderful. And we hear that over and over again, Michael, the sheer usefulness of that book in so many situations. Can we have yours now?
Well, first of all, thanks very much to David for that recommendation. It was Eddie's birthday yesterday, so that was very, very important. Yes, I wanted to go back to my childhood and think of a book that really mattered to me beyond, I don't know, sort of beyond what the story is almost. And the one that comes back to me again and again is Emil and the Detectives by Erich Kästner, German writer. The book came out in Germany in 1929 and in England in 1931. And to follow the story, you follow the hopes and wishes and tension and panic of this boy, Emil. And the story, as people know, as most of the adults know, but anyway, is that he's got to take some money to his grandmother in Berlin. And the money gets nicked from his pocket. And the whole mixture of his tension, but also his guilt, because he's done something naughty in his little home village. I won't spoil the story and say what. And the way in which the story is hung between the whodunit of trying to find out who's nicked his money. He's got a pretty good idea. The lovely cooperation between the boys and one girl in Berlin, and then this overhanging guilt that's bothering him. For me, as a child, I mean, I was him. I mean, we're talking about being in other people's shoes. I was Emil. I mean, there was no doubt about it. I just knew I was him. So for me, it did the trick. And I also read it to my own children, and they loved it as well. So for me, it's a very potent book about being in someone's shoes and literally traveling from this little village, Neustadt, I think, to Berlin.
Ooh, so powerful. Yeah, great. Robin.
Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing as what Michael was doing and think about what was really special to me when I was reading books with my children. And I'm pulling out something that's quite old, actually, from the 1970s. Can you see that?
Yes.
Frog and Toad by Arnold Lobel, a series of 4 books, which is just a beautiful rendition of the experience of friendship and, falling out, making up, and being in that special bond with each other through the highs and the lows of everyday life. It was they're just beautiful, gentle books that just touch on every emotional experience that we have in our everyday lives. It's that kind of navigation of what happens in every single day through all of our human interactions. And it just meant a lot to me when I was reading it with my children. They really loved it. And I loved it so much that long after they had grown up and they were past that kind of a young reader stage, I was still enjoying them myself.
It's lovely. Thank you all. So this is our format tonight. We have till 7:30. Michael and Robin will kick us off with a couple of conversation starters. Then we'll have a panel discussion. And then we're going to try really hard to leave around 20 minutes for your questions in the audience. If you have any, do send them over, but put a queue in front so we can separate them out from general commentary. If you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, leave us a comment. Feel free to tweet too. And then we're going to end with everybody's empathy resolutions, echoing what's been happening everywhere today as children have been deciding how to put empathy into action. So it'd be fab if you could be thinking about yours, as we'd really like to hear what everybody's is and to see them on your social media channels. So let's get cracking. Michael, you're going to give us your thoughts on the difference between empathy in reading and writing.
Yes, well, this panel is full of readers and writers, and I'm a reader and a writer, and I often reflect on this, and we talk about this. I have students at university where I teach Goldsmiths, and this business of how you construct stories and how you figure out what you do when you read is part of the nice thing we can do on a master's course. So this often gets me to reflect on what is the difference between reading and writing. Now, we think of them as very different activities, but in some ways they're very similar, because as you write, you are the first reader of that book. We often think of handing the book over to the first reader, but in actual fact, you, the writer, are the first reader. So actually, what does it mean to be a different person, the reader, the writer? And for me, the interesting thing about reading is the amount of space you have. It's a very democratic medium to decide who you like and don't like, who you identify with and don't identify with. Of course, the writer will have tried very hard to control you, but in actual fact, you have enormous freedom and can decide on all sorts of things to do in relation to this book that you're reading, in front of you. Yeah. So, but the writer, in a funny sort of way, has less choice, because what the writer has to do is to identify at some level or another with each character that writer creates. They have to get inside the shoes of each one. I mean, just to take an extreme, if you take, say, Roald Dahl's Matilda, where we have two vast extremes with Miss Trunchbull and Miss Honey, it's necessary for the writer of a text like that to put themselves in the shoes of the most horrible person and the nicest person. Or if you think of another example, I know it's not a book, but it's a play, Macbeth. Well, you know, most of us don't usually think that Macbeth's a great guy. But on the other hand, the writer, in this case Shakespeare, whoever wrote those plays, had to put themselves in the shoes of Macbeth. So famously, Macbeth is full of self-pity. So he sits there and says, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, creeping this petty pace from day to day till, oh dear, am I having so much trouble? You know, I'm a murderer and I'm having such a difficult life. Well, for Shakespeare to have done that, he had to have empathized with the situation that Macbeth's in. As a reader or a spectator to it, we can just go, oh, shut up, you horrible old moaner, we hate you anyway. We have that freedom. So that interests me quite a lot, that space of freedom that we have as readers, and the funny sort of way as writers that we're trapped in this thing. The trapping, in actual fact, involves empathizing with all sorts of revolting people. And this, of course, makes us writers at times slightly dubious, because we do have to empathize without necessarily sympathizing with some of these revolting people we create. So I'm interested in that whole tension between writing and reading, and particularly, just to finish, is the idea that when we write, we then step back and become readers immediately and have to imagine that we didn't actually create that text. So there's a funny way that we then put our reading shoes on. So writer empathizes with reader. I know it's getting complicated now. Okay, empathizes with the reading position and then tries to read it anew. Of course, it's impossible, but we try to and go, oh, I don't know whether my readers might, maybe I need to just bump that bit up. Give that bit a bit of a tweak. I tell you what, I'll make Macbeth just a little bit more horrible. Yeah. So we do the tweaking. We've got our little dials in front of our writing machines, you see, and we can do that. But we do that as a reader. So in fact, we hop between the two roles. So there we are. That's a reflection a little bit on the tension between reading and writing. Thanks. Thank you.
Oh, Michael, I think we need a Radio 4 series unpicking this.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I'll bring them up right away. Yeah. Reading and writing. Okay, yeah.
Thank you. Great. Robin, what do we need to know about the science of empathy? Because, of course, EmpathyLab works in a very cross-disciplinary way, and I think we need you to tell us the essentials, please.
Well, you know what? I'm just listening to Michael talking just now underlines one really fundamental point about empathy, which is that it somehow manages to be simple and complicated at the same time. There's so much to it. And I would say, actually, I think that when you're thinking about those revolting characters, Michael, I think that there is a job for readers to do, which does involve empathy as well. But empathy is not just one thing. And that's where I want to start. What the science of empathy shows is that actually, this is not just some kind of a monolithic unitary construct. There's actually multiple components to it. So on one level, there's the thing that I think we would all identify as empathy, which is basically sharing other people's feelings. That's what we would call an affective dimension of empathy. Feeling connected with other people because we're experiencing the emotions that we see happening for them. But there are other aspects to empathy as well. There's a cognitive aspect. And I would say when you're thinking about one of those revolting characters, even if we're not sharing their emotional experience, we might be being tested as readers to understand where that person is coming from. And in some ways, that play, that book might not make sense to us unless we have some degree of cognitive empathy to understand other people's feelings, to reason about, okay, so that's why that person's behaving in that way, because they're thinking in that dreadfully self-pitying way. But there's a third dimension as well, which is all about caring about other people's feelings as well, wanting to alleviate distress, wanting to help, wanting to support. And that's what we would call like an empathic or pro-social concern. It's like motivational. So you've got these three different things, affective, cognitive, and motivational, and all of them play a really crucial role in what empathy means to us and how it influences our behavior in the real world. One of the things I really like in EmpathyLab's approach is that it quite rightly describes empathy as a vital life skill. It's like a glue that connects us with each other. It influences our behavior, it influences our relationships, and in turn, because of that, it nurtures our well-being as well. Now, the science of empathy is still something that's very live. It's not like we've got all the answers to it. We know that there are strong biological foundations for it. Neuroscience tells us that what we see in the world around us happening to other people often activates the same parts of the brain as if we were experiencing them ourselves. We know that hormones play a huge role in our experiences of empathy as well. But we also know that there's a developmental lifespan approach that we need to take here. We know that this doesn't develop all in one go, and children don't arrive on Earth with a fixed quantity of empathy already just ready-made in them. Yeah, we do see young babies showing some degree of affective empathy, a kind of an emotional contagion, for example, where they respond to negative emotions in others distress. Think about babies crying when they hear other babies crying. So you can see those kinds of very simplistic affective contagion effects. But as they get older, you start seeing that transformation where you've got other dimensions of empathy coming into play, comforting other people, helping other people, and an increasingly sophisticated understanding of how minds work. And like I said, although there are strong biological foundations, what we also know is that the development of empathy, and in particular, individual differences in empathy, like what makes one person more empathic than another person, those factors are enormously influenced by the environment. Empathy is learned from our interactions with the people in our lives, from the everyday occurrences, which are providing like data to inform how we think and how we make sense of each other, how we even make sense of ourselves. And what's so special about EmpathyLab's work, and what's so special about all the wonderful things that everyone on this panel is doing, is that books and stories are just the most magical vehicle for promoting that empathy, because it's got that opportunity to connect people with the characters. And then the brilliant thing about it, of course, is that we talk about books and stories. They mean so much to us. The characters mean so much to us. We want to share that with other people around us. And we talk about it with other people in our families, in our schools. And there is good science, increasing science, to show that that aspect of reading and talking about what we're reading is highly, highly impactful for promoting empathy. And that's what's so exciting about all of this. That's why Empathy Day is such a big deal.
Oh, that's fascinating, Robin. And we're absolutely riveted by this emerging body of neuroscience research about that's showing what happens in your brain when you identify with a character and the feelings and the way it lights up particular areas of your brain. So it makes that identification with feelings like a sort of simulation of the real world, builds our real life empathy.
Our capacity for imagination is wonderful. And of course, that's what all of these wonderful writers here actually are able to capitalize on and nurture, actually. It's amazing.
Great. So maybe we could just turn to our authors, both as writers and readers, and hear a bit more about how it works, this link between books and empathy. And Catherine, what are your thoughts? How do you actually go about creating the characters that help your readers feel empathy?
I don't think, I mean, it's like Michael was saying, I actually have this story machine and I set the dials. No, obviously it's different, and it is about playing with ideas and people and being able to think about, the way I start a story or think of, I have that initial idea, but you think about the character. What would it be like to be in that situation? How would it feel? What would it make me do? What would it make me say? How would it make me respond to whatever it is I'm responding to? So it's that, really. It's and the thing about when you're writing a character in that situation is making sure it responds in a way that is true to that character, whoever that person is. And what both Robin and Michael were saying, you are on the one hand, it's fun. You can have a go if you're writing a terrible, horrible character, but you've in order for that character to have some truth in them, you've got to think, well, why are they like that? What is it about this person that makes them respond like that? And because as a writer or a reader, we only have one life experience, but with stories, you can have a million experiences, and you also don't have to get up.
Yeah, David, I've heard you talk so interestingly about how the author and the reader work together to really understand what's going on in a character's head. And I wondered if you could share some of your thinking about that, and also would really like to hear about your choice of disability as a kind of theme in Taylor Turbo Chaser.
Sure. I was really interested in what the other people on this panel have been saying there, because I kind of think that empathy is at the heart of a certain type of writing, perhaps all types of fictional writing. The point about Macbeth that Michael made is really interesting in terms of him being a bad character, but of course what he is, as Michael was making clear, and that's what Shakespeare's genius is, making him a flawed character. So choose another character, for example, in Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, is a character who I think Shakespeare sets out to write a sort of anti-Semitic play in a very simple way, but because he's a great genius, he has to give the character humanity. And he can't write a very simple one-dimensional villain, sort of like the Jew of Malta had been written by Marlowe a little while before. He writes a character who, although the context of the time would have seen them as a villain, he gives them the does not have a Jew eyes, if you prick me do I not bleed speech, and reaches out to a communality that would have been very unusual at the time. And that is the act of empathy in writing. That is Shakespeare being such a great genius that even before anyone else had done it, he is really able to put himself in the mind of this character who would have been reviled by most of the audience. And I think that when, at a much smaller level, when people like me write, then you are trying to do that. You are trying to do that, in a children's book, you might feel like, oh, the moral map of this is very simple, and here's the good characters, here's the bad characters. But actually, I think we all would mix it up more than that. So to use a sort of, to go from the sublime to the ridiculous by using The Merchant of Venice as an example, I'll get to the Tale of Turbo Chaser in a minute, but in my last book, Fred, there's two villain characters who are conspiracy theorists, and they're a father and son, and they're pretty horrible or whatever. But The Future Friend is about a girl from the future who comes back to now, and she can see inside other people's heads due to sort of various X-ray vision she's got. And when the boy conspiracy theorist bully comes over and tries to bully her and her friend, the way that she sort of defeats him is not by, fighting him, but by looking into his brain and seeing what all his fear is. And that's why he's doing this. I can see the areas of fear. I can see how you think of yourself and why you're so angry and whatever. And by doing that, I think you don't necessarily empathize totally with the villain, but you do start to a little bit. It's not just a question of here's the character who's outside your understanding. And I think the act of writing is really about that. So with Amy, who is a disabled girl whose electric wheelchair gets supercharged by her friend Raoul into a kind of amazing car, I'll be honest with you, it started with me wanting to write something about a kid who was driving. And that's an empathetic act in a little way, because I think as a children's writer, I don't know how the other writers on this panel feel like this, but the way I empathize with children is I just channel the child inside myself, who still totally exists. He's still there. I'm still basically 12 inside myself. There's only one person in the whole world who is the age they look, and that's Michael Gove. But the rest of us inside, we're about 12, right? And when I was a kid, I really would like the idea of driving my dad's car. So I thought, oh, well, I'll use that wish fulfillment thing. But instead of it just being me or a boy like me, how can I make this a more interesting story, really? How can I make this speak a bit, in a more interesting way to children? And I thought, okay, well, what if it's a girl who was actually in a car accident, but still really loves cars? And she thinks of her electric wheelchair as sort of like a car. And she would like it to be a bit more like a car. So she gets friendly with this kid who's a kind of genius, engineer, and makes it into a car. And for me, I'm not trying to sort of impose a moral lesson onto children. What I'm trying to do is tell an entertaining story that somehow through the story messages about what a disabled person might be like and how their life doesn't involve always being defeated and whatever will come through the story. But it won't have like top-down moral lessons in it. So I think, I'm probably going a bit off track here, but I think that if you're doing the right thing in terms of storytelling, your empathy should shine through anyway, is sort of what I'm saying, in the creation of character and in the creation of story.
You know what you said there, David? It seems so powerful to me because it connects back to what Catherine was saying about truth, right? That there's something really authentic and there's something very truthful about it. And it comes down to what you said, David, about having humanity in the characters. that they feel human. And that's something really powerful, because when you're reading a story where there's a character who feels kind of two-dimensional, what you're actually lacking is that sense of humanity, that sort of complexity of being a human being. So I think that's what actually is shining through from the all the wonderful work that you guys have been producing. It's so good. It's
so often what readers say, isn't it? It's that feeling of caring about the character. Even Macbeth, that sense of visceral connection. So Michael and Catherine, do you recognize some of what David is saying in your writing experience?
Sorry, do you want to go first, Michael?
Quite interesting for me is that quite a lot of my writing is in the voice of I. So I do write fiction, but it's quite interesting when you write in the voice of I. This is a cheat in some respects, because it isn't you, it's your textualized you. It's the words that you've created in order to make this I figure. And though I'm quite often trying to write about real experiences, so we come back to this point about truth, it interests me because I can be several I's at the same time. I can be the I that I was, as David says, 12, or in my case 9, or I can be the reflective I of now, and I can move between the two if necessary. And it's quite interesting. I was visiting a Zoom visit today in a school, and I was working to and fro between being the me sitting at the table while we're all blowing on our food, apart from my father who's warning us that the potato's hot. Well, yeah, we knew that. And then I sort of, as it were, open it to the audience and say, just as I said there, well, we knew that, didn't we? So in 1 minute we sit down to eat and the potato's a bit hot, and I describe that. And the next minute I turn and say, well, we knew that, didn't we? Which is then me. So this business of being several I's is quite interesting for me personally. And I think what it's about is that, the way I explain it to children is that inside our heads, there's a great morass of ideas and feelings and thoughts, and they're disordered. They're all in all sorts of kind of jumbled up stuff. And sometimes it's painful, sometimes it's bliss and it's daydreamy, but a lot of the time it can be quite painful. And then when you take it out, one word at a time, one line at a time, one passage at a time, it puts it into an order. Now that order, you then have to decide as a person, if you're writing in the I, you have to ask yourself, is this true or is this a lie? It's really basic. A lie is okay because, a lot of writing is. It's okay, but you have to be careful and you have to know whether you're doing it. And in my case, say like a book I've just written about last year, I had to keep checking and saying, don't tell the truth, Michael, tell it, because that's what will count. That's what will matter. Yeah. And, we have to make those decisions if you write with that word I in it. And then I've discovered, over the years, that writing that in a certain kind of way, it does enable children to think, wow, what would it be like to get up in the middle of the night and nick chocolate cake and come down and there's just a little mark of chocolate cake by the side of your mouth, and your mum spots it and realizes it was you that nicked the chocolate cake and there's why there's none left, sort of thing. Though she'd have known anyway, come on. That if you write it with that element where you've got that monitor inside your head saying, go on, tell it like it was and check, then that seems to help with the empathy. It seems to enable people to do it. It's slightly illusory, but at any rate, there's this element of getting it into an order and a shape, which we didn't invent. We inherit through a process called intertextuality. We inherit those things from other texts. But even so, if we've got that little monitor, come on, tell it like it was. Or if you're going to tell big fibs, if you're going to do it, well, then flag that up as well. But don't try and confuse the two.
Yeah, because I've been writing recently a lot of historical fiction with real people in it. It's tricky because obviously I may be old, but I'm not that old. And as David said, I am actually, I'm probably 13 because I'm a bit bossy. But you don't know what these people said and did. So you're sort of hidebound because it's got to, if you're writing any kind of fiction, it's got to seem true, even if, as David said, there's somebody coming from the future or, whatever is going on. It's got to you know, then when you've got your reader hat on, you give yourself up to that. But if you're actually using either real people or conversations that you're completely making up, but they've got real people, it's quite tricky. That, you know, what are you saying? And you produce a book that says this is a story about the past, and you know, I wasn't there, I never saw, I don't know, and then it goes back to that thing with the reader empathy hat on, which is, if you think about how people are, if you think about how people make decisions, how people speak, we're all pretty much the same. I think that's something important. I think using that helps write about them.
I think you're right, Catherine. I mean, one of the things that occurs to me when just hearing you speak is that there's something here about the fact that, I know people say that everyone's got a book in them. Now, that certainly hasn't come true for me, but there is something quite powerful about the fact that actually we're all rather good at creating narratives. We tell stories all the time, and maybe not explicitly as a, you know, story time where we're creating some sort of a fictional story, but we create narratives to explain things in our everyday lives all the time, right? This is what I always say to people, all of us, whether we like it or not, we're psychologists. We're always trying to make sense of the things around us. We're always trying to make sense of, why did that person behave that way? Why did they say that? And we may not even be thinking about it very explicitly or consciously, but all the time we're writing stories in our head. And it seems to me that actually that's what all those different facets of empathy allow us to do, to write those narratives in our heads every single day. And of course, there's something about accuracy as well, right? Because in everyday life, we're often going to be writing narratives about what we think is going on in a given situation. You know, when a child is trying to join into a playground game, they've got to try and work out what's going on in that game. They've got to try and work out what the story is so they can be part of that story as well. And actually what happens as children get older is they become more and more sophisticated because of the growing empathy. They become more and more sophisticated in understanding the story and sharing the story with other people. And we all know what it feels like when our narrative is different from other people's narrative, right? That's disruption. Then you feel like, hang on, that doesn't fit. So I think we're all building narratives all the time, and we just get better and better at it.
Yes, I just wonder if I could add there that one of the ways in which we do narratives is that as we read, we can't stop ourselves from comparing ourselves with what it is we're reading. So rather pompously, I've called this with my students analogizing, okay? So I think it's a very interesting thing where what we do, and if you share stories with children and you give them the space and the time rather than immediately asking them what, you know, Billy wears a blue hat, what color is his hat? Blue, 1 mark. That if we can get away from that immediate directive kind of way of asking questions about books, but have a much more open-ended way, as inspired by name drop Aidan Chambers and his approach to responding, is that we leave space for children, young people, to do this storytelling as a response to story. And when we do that, and we do all do it, you only have to watch Gogglebox to see people doing it, is that when we respond with one story, what are we doing? We're actually taking one element, or maybe more than one element, but taking elements out of one story, putting those elements into ourselves and saying, what have I done that's similar to that? And we pull those out. And so we've created a little category. It might be anger or being fed up or being tricked. And then we tell a being tricked story that's analogous to it. So we've actually started on a little trip of abstract thinking. It's the first step. We're making categories. We're saying, oh, that's a jealousy thing. And I know a jealousy thing. So I've got a little category here. It's called jealousy. We may not use that word, but we've done it almost without knowing we've done it. That's the power of fiction. And then, you know, when we talk about how we talk about fiction, what teachers can do and do is to draw that out. And so we actually use words like jealousy, hate, desire, these things as a way of actually making generalities about it. And that's very, very powerful, and if you like, educative in the broad sense of the word, because it then enables us to generalize our experience. I remember my daughter, my 7-year-old, when reading Persephone and the pomegranate seeds, and in the version that we had, Persephone takes pity on Pluto, and she asked me, what is pity? Well, then we thought of an analogy. We thought of her being sorry for her younger brother when he fell over, and suddenly we've got a little triangle of her and her experience, the experience of Persephone, and then this abstract word pity. And all this work has been done by reading Persephone and the pomegranate seeds and just chatting, and all that abstract work, but also, well, as it happens, Persephone was being empathetic with Hades, weirdly, but anyway, never mind that. Yeah.
Catherine.
I wanted to say this actually first. It came up when you mentioned Emil and the Detectives, which I had a wonderful primary school teacher called Mrs. Salter who read that to us in, I think, whatever, 3rd year or 4th year, 5 or 6. And she read a lot of books, and I read a lot of books because of her. And the thing about them, what I was used to as a girl in North London, as a mixed race girl, was totally being able to identify with boys. And boys had the best fun. They did all the things. Who wanted to be Pony? And then nobody. Do you know what I mean? If you're playing that book, no, I don't want to be that character. So, obviously it's better now, especially if you were a kid and a wheelchair user. And I think back to my kids' primary school, even in Hackney 25 years ago, there were other abled kids, and I think there is something, even as an adult, about seeing yourself spoken to in a book, whether it is your race. I just read yesterday the new Deborah Levy, and she's 59, and she's a woman, who's decided that in her real life she's no longer going to be a supporting character. Sorry to talk about middle-aged women, but it's that same thing. And that when you're a kid, I went through a period, I think it would be year 6, I'm spitting like a boy in pavements and wanting people to call me Sunny, because that was the thing. You could not have an adventure, because who had all the fun? Boys and, race. Well, there was nobody. I can't remember.
I think the larger discussion about representation and inclusion is all about this. It's about trying to create a palette of storytelling which doesn't exclude, and that itself is an empathetic act. That I think that the feeling, that is there in the decision, I guess, to make the Taylor Turbo Chaser not about a boy who really loves cars, but about a disabled girl who really loves cars. It's, as I say, I just think at some level that's a more interesting story, but somewhere behind that is an impulse to mix up what the reader, whoever that might be, a boy, girl, whatever, might think about who might be interested in cars, right? That isn't just a 10-year-old boy. That's sort of like, for me, that's like, I just trying to avoid the obvious at some level, but avoiding the obvious is handed down in particular ways and in particular stories. Yeah. And the stories that we tell ourselves, as Robin said, are not necessarily straightforward in terms of how they come to us. And in fact, some stories lack empathy, I think, are the stories that are handed down to us anyway. They can lack empathy, and they can certainly lack the ability to include. So I think in sort of like changing the narratives that are handed down to us, that itself can be an empathetic act, because you think, okay, who hasn't been included in this storytelling up to this point? And the failure to do that is unempathetic. And so trying to resist that is more empathetic, I would say.
Yeah. Oh, guys. I want to leave enough time to kind of broaden out a little and just talk a bit about the need and empathy in education and in society. And one of the things that's been really noticeable this Empathy Day, we've done, this is our 5th, is how much everybody says to us, if ever we needed empathy, it is now. And I think there are layers of reasons for them saying that. But David, I know you had quite strong feelings when we talked the other day that I'd love to hear more about why you think this is particularly pressing at the moment.
Well, it's to do with social media, I think, and social media is a complicated thing that you can't really sum up. I think it's affecting one, moral decision, like it's bad or it's good. It's a number of different things, but I think that there's a specific issue maybe with empathy, that this technology that should allow for communication on a scale that no one's ever really thought about before, mass communication in a way that no one has ever been able to imagine before, should imply an incredible amount of empathy, perhaps, in an ideal world. In an ideal world, the transparent communication of ideas amongst many different people, many different types of people, should be really great. But what you actually get a lot on social media is the opposite. You get sort of a minimization of truth, and you also get a minimization of empathy, because when people are incredibly horrible on social media, which of course they are some of the time, what that is about the failure to think of the other person as a real person. That's what it's about. And actually you see this all the time with trolls, that actually when trolls are forced to confront that person as a real person on those rare occasions where you see documentaries where I don't know, someone from Atomic Kitten's gone to meet their troll or whatever, the troll is often immediately very, sad and sorry about what they've done, because of course they see the person as a real person and they think, oh, all those horrible things that I was saying, they actually have impact. And what I failed to do was imagine the impact in the mind of the other person. And that, in a very simple way, is what we're talking about today. And I do think that social media can create a situation where that, is very needed. It's very needed within the discourse.
But see, that's the ultimate irony around empathy, right? Because empathy can have many, many different targets. We can be very empathetic towards people who are in our, what psychologists would call our in-group, right? We can be very empathetic towards people in our in-group, thinking, all right, I'm going to try and be in my echo chamber, say things that I know are going to support the other people in that echo chamber, and get tons and tons of positive feedback in return. And we amplify that positive feeling within that little bubble. And all the time, we are making a choice to empathize within a very select target group. And we're also making a choice specifically and explicitly to empathize not with people who are with people who are not in that in-group. So we're making a specific decision to say, actually, the other, I'm not going to worry about them. In fact, I'm going to focus so much on what's bonding me with the people in my in-group that it happens at the expense of the feelings of people in the out-group. And that becomes a hugely problematic issue. And I think what this brings us back to is actually the word that you used before, humanity. Because actually, all of us are human. There's a common humanity to all of us. And until we have an empathic reaction which is focused on that common humanity which we share, regardless of our group identities, regardless of which group I particularly identify with, when we have that sense of common humanity, that's when we really open the doors to what empathy has to offer. And I think it's like being aware of who we are being empathic with is a really important task for us.
Yeah.
Michael. The problem is, of course, is if your face is being ground into the mud by somebody, it's hard to be empathic with that person and where you go. So the problem about a purely humane view, and I do hold that, we are the same organisms across the human race, that we are fundamentally the same, but the structures of society, politically, organizationally, mean that, of course, these are unbalanced, so that there is a problem in that. I would just say, following on from David, is that, of course, I've witnessed something in this last 18 months, something that completely horrified me, which is, how can I put it, that in the face of this pandemic, that some people have responded to it, that it mattered less that some people died than others. And this was made explicit in a variety of ways. I'll give you just one example. An unnamed but quite famous journalist put up on social media, so following on from what David's saying, that some of these descriptions that some of these people who got ill about their long COVID were very lurid and exaggerated. So just as the part of social media, I responded by saying, yes, I made up being ill. And when I said her name, I said, I made up being ill. I was hiding under the table for 3 months. And she came back and said, yes, no, Michael, we know you were ill, but you're 74. Now, I keep going back to this phrase, but you're 74. And of course, it's got the word but in it. Sorry to reduce the whole thing down to one word, but I do get a bit like that. So I keep thinking about what is the frame of mind that this person was in where they said, but you're 74. I mean, she could have said, but you're 104. I'm not really bothered. It's just the but. So in other words, in her mind, and Robin talked of social constructs, so in her mind was a social construct that presumably, I mean, as it happened, she's 66, so I'm guessing somewhere midway between 66 and 74, the but comes in, and therefore any argument about how this pandemic was operating with people was differentiated between those one side of the line and those the other. Now, what's being weighed up there is that a day in the life of a 74-year-old is less valid than a day in the life of a 66-year-old. And I'm just citing this as one example of hundreds, thousands, many more, right the way across. In fact, even at the very moment that I got ill, I was in the BBC Radio 4 studio talking about, I had the impression that somehow or other people of my age were being written off, and I was actually ill at the time. So it's quite funny that even at that very moment, and I sort of whiffed it in the air, so this is way back March 2020. And indeed, I've seen that part of social media has amplified that very notion that there is a chunk of society that matter less than the others. And we're not talking about evil people, and we're not talking about people that we're writing off because they've done bad things. We're writing them off because they're older. Okay, so we have to take on that society has that ability to turn on itself and eat itself. Think of that incredible Goya picture of people eating themselves, you know, through, I think he was picturing civil war in a kind of metaphorical way. That moment, I felt that there was a vast empathy loss without people even realizing that that's what they were doing. They were coming up with rationalizations. Well, old people, they've had a good innings, you know, or whatever. So in other words, that existential matter of their day isn't worth what my day is worth was very much to the fore. And in a sense, it was interesting to see it, as David's mentioned, social media, that it was there and you could see it. And in fact, people, they basically argue with me quite often on social media saying, like this journalist who's unnamed, it was saying, well, you know, you're a bit of an old hack, aren't you? You know, you're ready for the knackers yard, you know.
No, Catherine.
Not yet.
It's all the sad thing is that there's it's always been like that. There's always some people who are less or disposable, or in fact, what I'm trying to say is that even you go to the swimming pool and you'll overhear a conversation because you're in cubicles, which I did the day before yesterday, and you know that people, a certain group of different people, are not considered the same as everyone else. And we have this wonderful, in a lot of schools, a wonderful atmosphere where, you know, there's an atmosphere of fairness and sharing and empathy. But then in the wider world, it's like, you know, getting children to read. And the reason why a lot of children don't read is because adults don't read. And you go into the wider world and empathy is not valued. It's not valued. What's valued is the very opposite. What's valued is this sort of elbowed out thing. And this is what gets me, actually, about the whole conversation. So you get things like what Michael's saying, excuse my language, where, you know, because you're older, you are less valued. Because you are a different religion to whatever the mainstream religion, you're less valued. Because you appear different, because you might wear different clothes, because you are a different colour, you are less valued. So, as Robin was saying, you're not in the in group. Whether you're a woman, you're not valued. Oh, you're not valued. And it's that. And I think children, they might not be born with it, but you very soon, because children tend to be a lot subject to ridiculous rules, really understand righteous indignation. Yeah. And you have that. And I think what a lot of children's writers do is speak to that righteous indignation, which sort of wears off, I think, the older you get.
It's interesting, isn't it? We, in our work with parents in schools, I think a lot of them recognise that, you know, so there's a lot of the work we're doing is empathy education in the loosest, most creative sense through books. And actually they do really get the point that for their child to get on in life, if you just look at it through a sort of selfish lens, empathy is a crucial life skill. So you're gonna be a rubbish employee if you can't get on with other people, and people do see that. So I'd really be interested in your views on empathy in education, because a lot of you work in schools, and I'm thinking right now, I promise to leave plenty of time for audience questions, and I'm thinking perhaps we could take that empathy in education in its broadest sense into the next section, which is to hear from the audience. And Robin, I know that you will have interesting things to say about empathy being learnable and your work in Wales, and loads of good stuff.
I mean, you know, the thing is, and I don't want to take up too much time because we have to make time for the questions, but it's such a fascinating discussion. The difficulty is that there are always going to be differences of opinion about what should happen in a given context, how, especially when there's concerns about a sort of a finite set of resources, how we're going to distribute the resources, right? That's one of the things we often we use in psychological studies with children, is looking at resource allocation studies, where we look at how do children allocate resources and what does fairness mean in that context. And there are always going to be really complicated societal issues for us to grapple with in that. I think what's really powerful about children's books in general, stories in general, is that they make us ask the questions, and instead of just taking it for granted, not even giving it attention and just reacting without thinking it through empathically, I think what stories and books have the power to do is to invite us to consider those questions and to recognize that there might be differences of opinion about those kinds of things, and to interrogate those and to explore those with each other. And I think that's what empathy education is all about. It's not giving us the answers, it's giving us the questions.
So I'm going to ask my fellow founder, Sarah, to join us, who's going to help us do the questions. Sarah, are you with us? Great. And for those of you out there in schools and libraries who've been doing an extraordinary range of creative activities, they're mostly Sarah's ideas. So Sarah, over to you for the questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Miranda. And we've been just listening into this amazing discussion. It's been absolutely fascinating. And we've had loads of comments and loads of questions coming in as well. And lots of them are comments and discussions that are coming in as we're speaking. And the first one's quite a hard-hitting one, so I'll ask it first and then we'll see how we go. And it's from Annie. And Annie says, if the government asked you what the one thing they could do to help make our society more empathetic, what would it be? And I can ask, should we start with any one of you? So, Catherine, you're smiling.
One thing, I think probably fairer and more taxation, something awful like that.
That's interesting.
I don't know.
Interesting.
I think we need some kind of fairness, some more fairness. You know, why a higher minimum wage or something?
I think fairness is a really key part of empathy, actually, and it's going back to what you were talking about, children, and that sense of injustice that children have, and actually that fairness is really strong. Robin,
I think we have quite a lot of empathetic people in government at the moment, which would make it quite difficult to know exactly what they would say. So you mean an ideal government, what they would do if they were worried about that? I don't know the answer. The one thing I always think I'm really bad at is sort of legislating. I think my job is sort of like analyzing and seeing the world and representing the world, and sort of a map to making it better, I'm often not very good at. But there was a thing that was said earlier about how you can learn empathy, and Robin apparently has written about that, and I think that's true in myself. I'm much better than I used to be when I was younger. Things like having children and like marrying someone who's much more empathetic than me has really made me think more. I don't know in terms of children, when I had children, one of the things that happened was I started to really think about how life felt from another person's point of view. In a very visceral way. I mean, I had done that. I wasn't a completely selfish person, but I think, it really, for the first time, made me think about, oh, they have a point of view that is like really in my head now, right? So I'm not saying that everyone has to have children. That would be a ridiculous thing. But I think sort of like trying some kind of way in which, I'm getting on to probably what might be my resolution later on, but spending some time with someone who is not you, who's in very much not you, maybe not in your social circle, doesn't necessarily think the way you do, maybe someone you don't know, and having to sort of live their life and understand their life, I think is a really good thing. It's a really good thing for people. I'm definitely going to repeat that when you come to my resolution. But that's what I think is it would be good, is breaking out of your normal sort of ways of existing and forcing yourself to think in another person's head and another person's reality. But I don't know how governments would impose that.
But you know what? Just hearing you say that, which I agree with 100%. What I think might make a difference is not necessarily. So I'm going to this is a bit of a cop out. I'm not going to give the content of what the legislation should be. Okay, but my take on it would be: what are the principles guiding the legislative process? What are the principles guiding the policy-making process? Because I reckon that achieving an empathetic society, achieving a fairer society, achieving a society where people feel respected and included and valued, where we have, let's face it, where we have a high level of subjective well-being, sense of meaning and purpose and fulfillment in our lives, that's not a guiding principle at the moment, right? So what is the thing that's guiding our decision making about what the right thing to do in a given situation? I would say we should try and make that more explicit. I mean, I'm not an expert, but I think make it explicit. What is it that we're shooting for? What are we aiming to achieve?
Isn't there a thing, I don't know much about this, whereby some countries are talking about sort of rating their success as a country not on GDP but on basic happiness? Isn't that a thing?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a complicated picture, right? As soon as you start getting into measures and metrics, there's always going to be ways you can pick holes.
I know, but it was kind of a legislative question, so you have to, don't you?
Really interesting.
Okay. Michael,
shall I go?
Yes.
Yeah. Apart from abolish capitalism, we'll leave that to one side. Let's stay within the educational sphere. I think we have a real problem in education in that we have a great octopus sitting on education in the form of competition between schools that have to be in a league table, which is based in turn on a highly oppressive testing system, which then, if you like, over individualizes education. So here we're talking about empathy, which relies on all kinds of listening to each other, cooperation, compassion. These kind of words surface the moment we start talking about empathy. And yet the system itself is organized so that every child has to amass a certain amount of marks, so the school can amass a certain amount of marks, so the school can be at somewhere on a league table. And this starts now with baseline testing at 4. We have testing of the phonics screening check. We have Key Stage 1 SATs. We have Key Stage 2 SATs. We have GCSEs. And we have all the pre-tests in order to rehearse for the big test that happens. Let's say if it's SATs at Key Stage 2, they're already rehearsing for that in maybe year 5. And GCSEs, the GCSE course will sometimes start in year 9. So this great octopus of competition sits on schools working in precisely the opposite direction from the one that we're talking about today. So, if just purely with our legislative hat on, as David has put it, and purely with something that's possible, then the magic wand in my mind would be to release schools from this bondage of this competitive system that is there, and have other means of assessing in order for education. It's called assessment for learning, AFL, which if you get rid of this summative testing and have instead formative testing, then suddenly you create a completely different structure around learning, and then enables students and teachers to cooperate on the learning process, instead of what is here at the moment, with teachers having to, as it were, force feed what is required for testing in order for then the school to succeed against other schools. So we have, certainly speaking to an English audience here, this for me is working in exactly the opposite direction from what we're talking about today.
Thank you. And there's a live question from Toria Bono, which is about how can teachers persuade leaders to include empathy as part of reading lessons and actually as part of the curriculum. I think it's something that EmpathyLab would love to achieve in the way that it actually is being achieved in Wales. But have you got any tips for those teachers who really want to persuade that educationalists that empathy is a really important part of the curriculum, not just in reading, I guess, but across the curriculum?
I'm going to step back from this one because I just don't know enough.
No, neither do I. I can't answer. I really can't answer that question. It's
Let me dive in.
More about education than I do.
Okay, let me dive in with big boots. So there is many kinds of research that have shown that reading for pleasure, widely and often, produce success, produce attainment in children and in school students. And if you want to take one example, Mariah Evans, her research, University of Nevada, going back to 2011, she looked at over 10 years at 27 different countries. But if you go to the National Literacy Trust and look at their work that they've produced, that everybody knows that reading widely and often, and reading for fun and pleasure, enables children to succeed. So if you want to convince school management, you can produce this research, and I can provide you with others, in order to justify it. But if you then got to justify it beyond that and say, well, how does it do this magic? Because, why aren't they being tested? Where's the comprehension test? Billy has a blue hat. What color was his hat? Blue. That surely produces attainment, So no, you can say that there is something, and it isn't magic as to how it is reading widely and often does the job. We've already touched on it. Empathy and analogizing are two of the processes, but there are many others. Analogizing, as I said, leading to abstract thought, that we can spell this stuff out, and we can look at the kinds of things we do in classrooms. When we say hot seating, so if we say, for example, I do hot seating, plenty of teachers do. So I've done it, with Hansel and Gretel, with quite young children. And you say, okay, so you've just been ditched in the forest. You're Hansel, you're Gretel, whoever you want to be. You could be both, you could be a tree. But this is the scene, and you've been ditched, you've been deserted. Now hot seat that. So do that from an empathy point of view. What are you thinking, Hansel and Gretel? And they write monologues, or they improvise them as in pairs, doing them, yeah? And then I heard in a school, it was East London school, one child saying, do you know how they began? They began by saying, what have we done wrong? Now, if you remember, think of the story, that one of the first things maybe some of us here now might think, we might say is, oh, I'm scared, or, why did my mum and dad leave me here? That's not fair. I wonder whether we're going to be eaten by wolves. All totally legitimate. But this child said, what have we done wrong? And you think how profound that is. And we ask a question, how is it that books do this magic? Psychologists, as Robin will tell us, they call that introjection. So what the child is doing is internalizing the values of the parents who've in fact abandoned them to die in the forest. And they say, what have we done wrong? This child said, what have we done wrong? And then when you share those ideas in a classroom, this is where you have not just simply emotional intelligence, but you have, if you like, academic intelligence. The child is grappling with the meaning of the text, from the inside, and then is able, when you then draw it out in conversation and you swap over and swap roles, you then start having objectivity made up of subjectivity. So you have collective subjectivities producing an objectivity. So we can explain this, if we try, we can explain this to school managements and say, this is how this stuff is happening. And then just finally, we can say about reading widely and often, you know what? It's all written in standard English, bar a few lines of dialogue. And we're always talking about, teaching children standard English. That's to say the written prose of standard English, right? Not spoken English, but written standard English. And we can teach it. We can teach exercises. We can say the boy sat on the blank, and then you can do an expanded noun phrase. The boy sat on the great big blank. Fine. But in actual fact, if you want to immerse children, just as the way you might learn French by going to France, you immerse them by reading widely and often in what? Standard English. It's just doing the job. I know it's not empathy, but in actual fact, if we want to go, hello, government, hello, management, this is how this stuff works, that's how it does it.
I'm going to add a little bit to that. I think that's absolutely right. But there's also a short-term, medium-term, and long-term picture that we need to take into account here. So on the one hand, there is the immediacy of actually developing academic skills through reading for pleasure and being immersed in books and stories. And like you said, there's so much that we pick up from just being engaged with stories that we find fun and that we want motivated to read and to talk about with other people and to explore with each other. That's one thing. But there's also something else that's happening as well. And that's the medium-term gain, which is that as we're developing those skills and giving us more insight into all the things that you described around language, we're also developing an understanding of relationships. And that is important for how we get on with each other in school, because school is a deeply social place, right? We're not just learning like automatons in a kind of a vacuum. We're learning with other people. And as every single child and young person would tell us, that's one of the biggest challenges in school, right? Is managing the social side of what it's like in that school environment. And empathy absolutely provides a foundation for fostering those social connections and enabling us to navigate the challenges. And those in turn, and we've shown this in our research, those in turn are predictive of academic attainment academic attainment outcomes later on. But the long term, the real prize is when we think about what I was asking before. What are we aiming for? Because so far, the two things that we've talked about, the kind of development of the academic skills and the well-being that might promote those academic skills, those things, we're still using the same success criteria. The ultimate sell, right, is going to be, well, as a result of this, you know what? You are going to do better in your GCSEs. Your kids are going to do better in their Key Stage 2 SATs. But the long-term prize is actually, what are we transforming our young people's lives through this? How are we transforming young people's lives through this? And I think that requires an interrogation of the success criteria, so that the ultimate goal isn't the GCSEs.
I abolished them. I abolished them.
Excellent. Brilliant. Thank you. And such compelling arguments. It's you kind of think why not? It absolutely is compelling, and we know from the small bits of work that we've already done what a difference it makes. I'm going to bring us back now to a kind of very small but actually really important question from Vanessa, and she says, can you be empathetic without actually liking someone?
Yes.
Yeah, well, that sort of comes back to what I was saying earlier about how I think, great writers, writing itself is partly an act of, if you like, mercy and understanding at times, with being able to put yourself in the mind of a character who may not be a good character straightforwardly, but it's pantomime. Writing is pantomime if it's just good and bad. It becomes art, for want of a better word, when the characters are complex, and complex means that a good character may do bad things and a bad character may do good things, or at least you may be allowed to understand why they do bad things, and that itself is an act of, that's an act of empathy, I think, because you want to be able to engage, I think, when writing, and engaging doesn't necessarily mean condoning. Yeah. So with a villain, for example, you might engage with them. You might actually kind of understand why they're like this. You might sort of like secretly enjoy their villainy and all that kind of stuff, which isn't about straightforwardly liking them. I personally think that sometimes the way that people think about books now is like if I don't like the characters, I don't like the book, and that I think is limiting. And I think with children, even you can say you can go further than that and say, characters can be all sorts of. They could be along a whole line of the moral spectrum, and you can still engage with them in all sorts of ways. That doesn't mean, in any simple way that you're screwing up children's moral compass. You're just allowing for complexity and allowing for an introduction to life, if you see what I mean. That life won't just be, people are good or they are bad.
And understanding why people do the things they do is one of the wonderful things about literature, isn't it? Yeah.
And I think in children's books, at least sometimes, one of the lovely things that I enjoy doing as a children's writer is, yes, I do like having a range of moral and pleasant and unpleasant people, but there is nothing more satisfying than having something horrible happen to somebody you really don't like, because in life it never happens, and you can, and it is, I do enjoy, that's the opposite of empathy, isn't it? But there we go.
Funny though.
Schadenfreude, right?
It's funny. I mean, that's true though. That's true. You're you can play with all sorts of justices or whatever that you don't get in real life. Exactly. I think as well.
Michael,
can I just pose a little problem? So you've referenced very kindly in this EmpathyLab my book, The Missing, and there's an episode that bothers me, and it keeps bothering me, and I can't resolve it, because another thing about this empathy thing is not that you go, right, I'm empathic. No, I'm not. It might not be an either or. It might be, I can't figure this out, and the actual empathy bit is trying to. So in The Missing, I described the fact that they're French policemen under the auspices of the Vichy government. I know it's a bit complicated, but all right. So the Vichy government wasn't the French government. It was the collaborationist government with the Nazis. And one night, in the middle of the night at 2:30 in the morning, 4 French policemen in a tiny village in Western France, knocked on the door of a lady called Madame Bobière. And the man who came to the door was my father's uncle. And they arrested him and handed him over to the Nazis, and who then sent him to Auschwitz. Now, the thing that I am disturbed by is not, as it happens, the Nazis. I've already put them in a box. I've done that. So, of course, I'm disturbed by it. I just mean I've compartmentalized it and dealt with it to a certain extent, if it's possible.
It's a collaboration.
So why did these 4 French policemen, why did they do that? And there they are. I've got their report. I've got their names and handwritten, and it says that they arrested this person. There's description of him, my father's uncle, what height he is, what he's wearing, and then how they've then done the job, and they've written it, and it's on an official notepaper, Gendarmerie Nationale. It was from the archives of the Vendée, the department where he was arrested. And I've been in French villages, and I've seen policemen, and I know what they do. If they're working at night, what they do is they go to the local cafe and they have a coffee and croissant. And I've sometimes sat when they've been doing that. And so in my empathetic mind, what I've done is I've joined them in that cafe after they've arrested my father's uncle. And I'm having coffee with them that morning. And I'm saying to them, what did you do last night? And they're saying, oh, we arrested the Jew. Not many around here, but we had an instruction from the sous-préfet, the sub-prefect, who came from the préfet, which came from Paris, which was by an agreement with the Nut. And we have a little chat about that. And then I'm stuck with this thing. I can't move it because I can't empathize with them. All I can do is I'm sort of stuck with it as an act of kind of complete, bewilderingly awful thing that 2 years earlier wouldn't have happened, and 3 years later wouldn't have happened. It just happened because of that situation then and there. And also that they didn't have sufficient means, ability, risk, whatever it is, to sort of either whisper and say, hide, I haven't seen you, I haven't met you, all the things they might have done. So it's quite interesting that though I can do empathy, there comes a sticking point, even though I know the whole historical situation, justifications and all the rest of it, there comes a sticking point with these 4 guys. Yeah. You see what I mean? And I've got their names and all the rest of it. So anyway, there you go.
Well, all I was going to say, Michael, is so obviously the Holocaust is possibly the greatest historical exercise in de-empathizing. it creates of a humanity, of Jews and other people, obviously, a class of people who have no humanity in the minds of the people oppressing them. So if you clearly, we as, you know, people are able at their worst to utterly be unable to imagine the humanity of the other. A psychosis, if you like, however you want to describe it, can set in, and not just in the Holocaust, in other times as well, in other terrible historical events, whereby the humanity of the other is unimaginable, right? So in a way, I don't know if this is helpful to you at all in thinking about it, what you have to imagine if you're trying to empathize with those people is people without empathy. People who, for whatever reason, in that moment have been hypnotized, or however you want to describe it, have been created in them a complete erasure of their own ability to empathize.
Thank you. Catherine.
It's the same as the people, as the journalist who says, "Oh, if you're over 74, you don't, you don't count," or any kind of industrial othering that has ever happened, and it's still happening now.
Exactly, it's now
industrial, on a massive scale. Industrial othering. So. And people, and they can be those 4 French policemen, or they could probably go home and be very empathetic, like Robin was saying, to the members of their in-group and be good people. But at other times, completely not. Like the guy in the swimming pool, in my local swimming pool, who is a complete out-and-out racist, but is very jovial and nice to people within his in-group. And you know this, really. Sadly, we all know this. That's how it happens, I think.
But it comes back, I think, it comes back to what we're talking about, which is, you know, we're talking here, aren't we, about the idea of empathy being foregrounded as what it means to be human, to be able to imagine the inner life, the inner humanity of another person, even if that person is very different from you, what they look like, what they think like, who they worship, whatever it might be. Okay, that is the condition of, if you like, civilized humanity, to be able to do that. And we know, both now and obviously in history, that ability can be ground out of people, which is why it is so important to be able to somehow restore it or keep it going.
So true. And the thing is, it brings us back to where I started at the beginning when I was talking about the different subcomponents, because it's not just sharing the feelings, it's not just understanding the feelings, it's also caring about the feelings as well. And all those 3 elements, the emotional aspect, the cognitive aspect, and the motivational aspect, all of them have to be there to produce that truly empathic response. And sometimes all 3 of them can be switched off in relation to a given target group or other person. And that's when we have these really, as you said, unspeakable horrors. But books and stories can be a vehicle to shine a light on it and to make us aware of when we've switched those things off.
Absolutely. And on that note, because I think that's a very positive note on which to stop the conversation, I just wanted to thank you all for answering those questions, and to thank everyone who's posted questions. We've only touched the surface of some of the really interesting questions and also the comments that have been going on in the chat. So thank you all for participating in that. And I'll now hand you back to Miranda.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah.
Oh, you're muted, Miranda.
I can't hear Miranda. You're muted, Miranda.
Oh,
You're good.
Brave new world, Miranda. Brave new world that have such people in it.
So that dovetails beautifully into empathy resolution. So what are we going to do about all of this? And all day, children have been making their empathy resolutions. And if you get a chance, everybody, tomorrow, look on Twitter, because they are gorgeous and really, really give you hope. So I wondered if you could kind of join the children in with your empathy resolutions. So why don't we start with Michael's?
A long time ago, Sheila Rowbottom wrote a book called Hidden from History, which was about women and in history. And this phrase, hidden from history, I don't know whether Sheila coined it, but it's certainly been used since. And this other word, unheard, the unheard. So my resolution is really what I have tried to do over the years, but maybe only incompletely, is to challenge myself with who has been unheard, why have they been unheard, and to try and find out more about it. And books enable us to do that. So I once had to teach a sixth form group, The Tempest, and I suggested that they'd research before we have a discussion group on what Shakespeare could have known about slavery and indigenous peoples outside of Britain, given the time the play was written, and then bring that to the discussion group so we could then talk about the play in the light of what Shakespeare could have known. And so that was in a way of releasing the unheard within the play. But exactly as David says, they're not entirely unheard, because we hear from Caliban and Ariel how fed up they are being slaves one way or another. Indeed, we hear of all sorts of people complaining, but we actually could put flesh on those complaints if we listen to the voices of the unheard from that time, if you like, in order to get it so it's contemporaneous. So I think my resolution will be to carry on and do more to listen to the unheard wherever they are, in Britain, in Europe, or indeed in the whole world, in other places in the world. Who is unheard? Why are they unheard? And what happens when we do hear them? So I've them there, because I regard myself as very heard. I'm not complaining about myself. So it is a them, trying not to other them, but I am saying it's them. Listen to the unheard.
Woo, that gives me a bit of a shiver. Woo. David, yours.
Yeah, mine's going to be what I just said earlier, which is it's sort of more for children, if any children are listening to this, which is it comes back to Robin's point about sort of being in an in-group, and I think children do that a lot naturally. They create little groups of friendship groups and whatever, and that's just a natural thing that children do. But I think if you are a child watching this, and it's slightly hard to imagine how I'm going to do it, so this is for children watching, go and meet someone and speak to them not in your friendship group, someone you don't normally speak to, that maybe you've thought, oh, I don't know about them, I don't like the look of them, or whatever innate, immediate, sort of instinctive sort of negativity you might have had to try and get rid of that, and go and talk to them and try and find out what their life is like, and maybe even find out what they think about your friendship group or whatever. Just basically, turn the mirror the other way round is what I'm saying. Go and find out about the inner life and the attitudes and the interests or whatever of someone you don't normally speak to, and that would be my resolution. I mean, I could also apply it myself, except I'm just in my house at the moment, so that'd be quite hard to find someone to do that with.
Oh, that's amazing, and it chimes incredibly with a listening switch exercise that two authors, Joe Cottrell and Robin Stevens, made for us last Empathy Day. It's being used in schools to do exactly that. Right. Connect children. I'll send it to you, David. It's just a very short video from an assistant head. It's great. Really great. Cool. Yeah, Robin. Sorry, getting you in the middle of your.
No, I was just getting it. Okay, so I'm going to say something which is slightly counterintuitive. Okay, my empathy resolution is going to be to not try to find solutions all the time. And the reason I'm saying this is because it's an extension of a resolution that I made last year, and I feel like I'm still very, very incomplete in it. The resolution I made last year was about listening, and to listen more. And that's a common resolution in relation to empathy, because of course listening is a first step. I mean, we heard Michael talking about the unheard. So important to listen. One of the things I realized over many years is that I'm often listening, but half my mind is already switching off and trying to find solutions to whatever the problem is that I've heard. And I realize that interferes with listening, because I'm not really fully engaged with hearing the voice of the person I'm speaking with, because I'm too preoccupied with immediately thinking in a very instrumental way, okay, so what are we going to do about this? And so my resolution is actually to give that bit of space, to give that time to authentically listen and worry about solutions later, to let the solutions come. I'm hoping, we'll see how well it works, but I'm hoping that actually by not immediately trying to focus on finding solutions to what I'm hearing, I'll actually hear better.
And that's a lifelong journey for us all, isn't it? Listening with our whole selves, 100%. It's yeah. Thank you. That was beautiful, Robin. Catherine, to finish.
It's a bit like Michael's, but what I'd like to do, in an ideal world, every year I would learn a new language. I wish, but because I can't do that, I'm going to try and read a book at least once every month, every 2 months, from a country I've never been to that's been translated, but so that I can go around the world in books and have stories from other places written by other people and learn a bit more about other ideas and other ways of thinking.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you, Catherine. And it's amazing. In November, we're going to revisit everybody's empathy resolutions with Michael, who is launching his stick book, which chimes in so beautifully with our theme of walking in other people's shoes. And we haven't worked out the details, but I'm really excited about the opportunity to check in with everyone. So can I ask you to put next year's Empathy Day in your diary? It's June the 9th. The theme will be empathy as a human superpower. And if you think you in any way can help us reach even more children than we've managed to reach today, please do get in touch. We're very small. We're mostly run by volunteers. We need £1 million. We need every school to be doing our schools program. We need expert volunteers. We'd love your help. And then I have to say thank you to our panelists. Gosh, you're great. And to our audience, doing vital empathy work out there in the community. We see you. And thanks to all those incredible authors and illustrators who've been leading these very electric activities today. And my profound thanks to the EmpathyLab team, nearly all volunteers who've delivered this day with such passion and such hard work. You are awesome. Get a little lump when I try and say that. So let's resolve to make every day an empathy day. And if you live or work with children, as we've heard, simply reading and talking about books through an empathy lens is a fantastic place to start. And there's masses of resources for you on our website. So we're looking forward to working with all of you to driving a new empathy movement forward. Let's go do it.
Yay. Thank you so much, Miranda, to you for steering.
Thank you, Miranda.
Thank you for being with us. Thank you.
Thank you.